Okay, so in this lesson, we're going to learn how to write an equation of a line where you're given the slope and the y-intercept. So let's kind of review something from the previous lesson. So in the previous lesson, you learned how to graph an equation in two variables, such as y equals negative 3/5 x plus 6. And what we did in that case was we used the used the t-table. So, and notice this is slope-intercept form, so we talked about that before. So I'm going to use a t-table. I'm going to pick values, since y is by itself, I'm going to pick values for x and substitute that into x to determine what y is. And I'm just going to go ahead and use 2 points here. So if x is, let's say, 0, I get y equals negative 3/5 times x, remember x is 0, plus 6. And then using the order of operations, I'm going to multiply before I add. So negative 3/5 times 0 is 0, and then 0 plus 6 is 6. So I get the 0.06. So when I plot that 0.06, I get this. Now I want you to notice that this is going to be the y-intercept right here. So that, remember, the y-intercept is where the graph crosses the y-axis. Now, to find the other point, remember, since the slope here is a rational number and I have a denominator of 5, it is easier to use values for x that are divisible by 5. So, for example, 5. So if x is 5, I get y equals negative 3/5 times 5 plus 6. And then again, you multiply before you add. So if you recall from a previous course that to multiply fractions, you might want to reduce first. So I'm going to write this as 5 over 1. And then you could, if you wanted to, have said negative 3 times 5 is 15, 5 times 1 is 5, and negative 15 divided by 5 is negative 3. You could have also reduced first. 5 and 5 is 1, 5 and 5 is 1, negative 3 times a positive 1 is a negative 3. So I get negative 3 plus 6, which is a positive 3. So I'm going to plot that point, 5, 3. I'm going to plot the ordered pair, 5, 3. So when I plot 5, 3, I get this point here. And so I'm going to draw the line going through those 2 points. And so there's the graph of the linear equation in two variables. Okay, now what I want you to notice though is that, remember, this is slope-intercept form, y equals mx plus b. So what you're going to notice is that wherever the graph crosses the y-axis, so recall that is b. That's your y-intercept. And the slope, and I'm going to go ahead and use rise over run. So to go from this point to that point, let's say, I went down 1, 2, 3, down 3. So my rise is a negative 3, and then I went to the right 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So my run is a positive 5. So remember, this is your rise. You learned that in a previous lesson, and this is your run. So the slope, remember, is rise over run. And so that's a negative 3 divided by a positive 5. And so the slope is negative 3/5. All right, so what I want you to notice is that this negative 3/5 is your slope. So some of this you remembered from a previous lesson. We learned this in the previous lesson. Okay, now what's going to happen, what I want you to notice is that whenever you're given the slope, and whenever you're given the y-intercept, whether it's a graph that's given or just general information about the slope and the y-intercept, you can automatically put it in slope-intercept form. So in order to use slope-intercept form, you have to know the slope and you have to know the y-intercept. Okay, so again, slope-intercept form, remember this is slope-intercept form. And so slope-intercept form, y equals mx plus b. In order to use it, you have to know the slope and the y-intercept. Okay, so listen to this carefully. So let's go back to our objective. So we're going to write an equation of a line where the slope is given and the y-intercept is given. So if the slope is given and the y-intercept is given, then it's easy to write the equation of a line. So remember, slope-intercept form is y equals mx plus b. And so when you write an equation of a line, if it's if the line's falling or if the line's rising, so recall, if the line's falling, the line's rising, you're going to have an equation in two variables. We talked about in the previous lesson, if the line's horizontal or if the line's vertical, you can have a linear equation with just one variable. The other variable won't be there. Okay, but if it's and remember in the previous lesson, if the line's horizontal, the slope is 0. If the line's vertical, the slope is undefined. So if it's a slope other than 0 undefined, the slope other than 0 undefined is going to be the line's going to be falling or the line's going to be rising, and you're going to end up with two variables, a linear equation in two variables. Okay. All right. So let's look at part A, or number 1. So the direction is going to say write an equation of a line. Write an equation of a line whose slope and y-intercept are, okay, A. So in part A, let's suppose my slope is 6 and my y-intercept, now remember we're going to denote the y-intercept the letter B, and my y-intercept is -5. Okay, and remember, all I want to do is write an equation of a line. Equation of a line. And we're not going to graph this. It's a lot easier just to, you could graph if you want to. You could graph the that line if you wanted to, but it is much more efficient to use the fact that if I want to write an equation of a line whose slope and y-intercept is given, then I can just use this form right here, slope-intercept form, because m is 6 and b is -5. So you just plug this back in. So the answer is just y equals m, which is 6, times x, and then b, which is -5. So that's your equation of a line. So notice, it's always easy to check because the coefficient of x is your slope and the constant is your y-intercept. All right, part B. Let's suppose in part B we had the slope equals 2/3 and the y-intercept is 6. All right, so if I want to use this slope-intercept form right away, I need to know the slope and the y-intercept, and I do. The slope is 2/3, the y-intercept is 6, and you just plug in, and you're done. So the answer will be y equals, the slope is 2/3 times x, and then that's a +6, you just say plus 6. All right. And it's easy to check because if you notice, these are all in slope-intercept form. So once they're in slope-intercept form, it is easy for you to determine the slope and the y-intercept. So the slope is 6. Now remember, don't say the slope is 6x. The slope is a coefficient of x. And that's assuming that y is by itself. So we talked about that in the previous lesson. So, so the slope is 6 and the y-intercept is 5. Easy to check. See? Slope is -5, 6. The y-intercept is 0. All right, so let's see what we get. We get y equals, again, we're using the slope-intercept form, y equals mx plus b. So the slope is -5, 6. I'm going to say -5, 6x plus 0. Okay, now listen carefully. Don't leave it like this. All right, so mathematically we prefer for you to write it as y equals -5, 6x, because -5, 6x plus 0, like 7 plus 0 is just 7, right? -8 plus 0 is just -8. 2/3 plus 0 is just 2/3. So 3x plus 0 is just 3x. All right, so just keep that in mind. So this is your answer. That's what you need to write down on as the answer. So don't leave it like this. You would need to remember some information from a previous lesson. So just write it like this. All right, D. Okay, so part D, suppose we had this. Suppose we had the slope is 0 and the y-intercept is -6. All right, now, before we go on to this one, I want you to notice. So remember the slope is +6, so your line's rising. The line's rising. Here, the slope is +2/3, so your line is rising. So remember, we talked about earlier that if the line is falling or rising, you're going to end up with an equation, a linear equation in two variables. You're going to see a y and you're going to see an x. So notice the slope is 6, the line's rising, you see a y and an x. Slope is positive, line is rising, you see a y and an x. You see a linear equation in two variables. Slope is negative, the line's falling, you see a linear equation in two variables. All right, now, here the slope is 0. So remember, the slope is 0. I just want you to remember this. The slope is 0. That means your line is horizontal. So the line's horizontal. Okay, so remember when you graphed a line that was horizontal, one of the variables was missing. So let's kind of review what that is using our current lesson. Okay, so listen carefully. So I'm given the slope. The slope is 0. I'm given the y-intercept is -6. I'm just going to plug into my formula, y equals mx plus b. And so I get this. Y equals 0 times x minus 6. But again, just like our discussion here, 0 times x is 0. And then 0 subtract 6, or 0 minus 6, is a -6. And so there's your equation. So remember, if you go back to all the graphs that we've done, when we graphed a line that was either horizontal or vertical, in this case it's horizontal, the variable x was not in the equation because the coefficient of the variable x was 0, and 0 times x was 0. Okay, so the line's horizontal, you're going to get a linear equation, but only with one variable. It's just y. All right, and then letter E, supposing letter E we have slope is -1 and the y-intercept is -2/3. So it is possible. I mean, remember there are an infinite number of lines that have this slope. So it's not always the slope. The y-intercept is not always a nice integer. It could be a fraction. But for our cases, when we graph these, it's always going to be the y-intercept is always going to be an integer because it's easier to graph. You don't have to estimate. So that's why you always see when we graph this right here, the y-intercept was an integer. So you could easily see it. The others, it was like -3/5. You would have to estimate where -3/5 is. -3/5 is close to -1. But it's okay that the y-intercept is a fraction. So don't freak out just because you see a fraction here. You just use a formula. Y equals mx plus b. Y equals mx plus b. And you just plug in. So y equals -1 times x. And then b is -2/3. Okay, now let me just say this, though. We prefer -1x. Remember, if there's no coefficient, there's going to be 1. So we prefer -1 times x to be written as -x minus 2/3. And so there's your answer. Okay, so notice you have two variables here. Linear equation two variables because the slope was not 0 and the slope was not undefined. Okay, so that's the end of this part of the lesson. So part A, that's into part A.